Good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York. I'm Ali Velshi in for Brian Williams. Day 224 of the Trump administration brings new information about the Russia investigation. Specifically, what evidence special counsel Robert Mueller has in front of him, who he's enlisting to help his team of investigators, and how they are working with President Trump's lawyers. The Wall Street Journal reports Trump's legal team has met with Mueller several times in recent months and even submitted memos to try to make their case to him. They report one memo, quote, outlined why former FBI Director James Comey would make an unsuitable witness, calling him prone to exaggeration, unreliable in congressional testimony, and the source of leaks to the news media. Another memo laid out the case that Trump has the inherent authority under the Constitution to hire and fire as he sees fit, and therefore didn't obstruct justice when he fired Comey. Trump's attorney says his legal team has great respect for the special counsel and will not be discussing incremental responses. Well, when the White House first announced the president was firing Comey, it said he was doing it because his deputy attorney general recommended it. In the following few days, the president explained himself and his decision this way.
Mr. President, why did you fire Director Comey? Why did you fire Director Comey?
Because he wasn't doing a good job, very simply. He was not doing a good job. Regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won.
The Daily Beast also has a new report tonight saying Mueller has enlisted the IRS for his Trump-Russia investigation. They add that the unit at the IRS is, quote, one of the federal government's most tight-knit, specialized, and secretive investigative entities. Its 2,500 agents focus exclusively on financial crime, including tax evasion and money laundering. We also have a new report from NBC News about that June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower involving Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and a small group of Russians. That report sheds light on some of the notes that Paul Manafort took during the meeting. The notes included a mention of political contributions near a reference to the Republican National Committee. Two sources briefed on the evidence have told that to NBC News. Now, a spokesman for Manafort says it is 100% false to suggest this meeting included any discussion of donations from Russian sources to either the Trump campaign or the Republican Party. When Donald Trump Jr. talked about this meeting, he called it nothing, and Manafort said he was on his phone most of the time.
The whole contact took how long? How long was the meeting?
20 minutes or so.
About 20 minutes. And Jared left after 5 or 10?
Yes.
Like she said, and Paul Manafort was on his
phone
the whole time?
Pretty much. Listen, like I said, it became pretty apparent that this was not what we were in there talking about.
Well, it does appear that Manafort was on his phone to take notes. NBC's reporting says Manafort's notes, typed on a smartphone and described by one source briefed on the matter as cryptic, were turned over to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees and to special counsel Robert Mueller. Our panel starting us off tonight, New York Times reporter Michael Schmidt, former chief of staff at the CIA and Pentagon, as well as former counsel to the House Intelligence Committee, Jeremy Bash, and former assistant Watergate special prosecutor Jill Wine-Banks. All three are MSNBC contributors. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us. Jill, let me start with you. I want to go back to that Wall Street Journal reporting on the memos that the Trump legal team has sent to Robert Mueller's team. The Wall Street Journal report also says that in giving the memos to Mr. Mueller, the president's lawyers hope to get a swift conclusion to the obstruction of justice piece of the investigation and potentially the exoneration of the president, the people said. Jill, what do you make of this offer to Mueller's team about their opinion on James Comey?
It's an interesting approach, and it's not uncommon. Many times defense lawyers come into the Department of Justice to give information that they hope will persuade prosecutors to drop an investigation, not to return an indictment, not to ask a grand jury to return an indictment. They also hope that they will get some sense of exactly where the department is in terms of its investigation and what its chief evidence is. So it's both for giving and getting. it's very unusual to argue that a witness isn't credible, because that's really up to a jury to decide. Unless they had something really specific, which I have not heard anything that would amount to that, it's unusual to rely on that. Their other arguments don't seem to be very persuasive from what the reporting is. They're arguing that he has inherent authority. That authority is voided if he's using it for the wrong purposes. You have an authority, if you're a government contract lawyer, to award contracts, but not in exchange for a bribe. You also can do anything you want in terms of pardoning or in terms of hiring or firing, but not if it's to obstruct an investigation into your own conduct. So I don't think that any of the arguments I've read would persuade me to drop any case against the president.
Well, many people were surprised to hear the president's comments to Lester Holt, where he did tie the firing of James Comey to the Russia investigation. Jeremy, let's just discuss, picking up on Jill's comments, how it would be to make the case that James Comey was somehow reckless or unreliable. He's typically described with words like careful or disciplined. I want to play you a sample of the way in which James Comey has responded to questions before Congress.
I don't want to answer that question, Senator, for reasons I think you know. I'm not going to answer about any particular investigations. I can't talk about that in an unclassified setting. Not a question I can answer in an open setting, Mr. Chairman. I want to be careful in open setting. I very carefully chose the words. And look, I've seen the tweet about tapes. Lordy, I hope there are tapes.
So, Jeremy, they're making the case that this guy who chooses not to comment publicly in front of Congress is somehow reckless and a leaker.
James Comey is very cautious. He's a professional. He's a career law enforcement officer and a career prosecutor. He, of course, served as an assistant U.S. attorney and acting U.S. attorney and has prosecuted many cases. He understands the law. And so the idea that he is an unreliable witness, I don't think really will go very far, particularly with Bob Mueller. After all, of course, Comey replaced Mueller as FBI director. They're sort of simpatico in their outlook on law enforcement. And just to come back to the original point about trying to undermine the argument about obstruction, the statute says whoever by a threat or by force tries to impede a federal investigation. It doesn't say whoever, in brackets, unless you're the president. No president is above the law. And of course, the firing was not the only basis upon which someone might investigate the president for obstruction. He, of course, took Jim Comey to the Oval Office, cleared the room, and said, please drop the investigation against Mike Flynn. It wasn't just the firing, and so there are multiple avenues for the special counsel to pursue with respect to obstruction of justice.
And, Michael, they are pursuing multiple avenues. We know that your last byline reported that Mueller's team is interested in talking to senior Trump administration officials. Now we know, we've certainly seen reporting that Mueller is working with the IRS. We learned last night that he's working possibly with New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman to perhaps have state charges brought that can't be pardoned by the president. In your opinion, what thread of the investigation are they pulling the hardest on?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is a very aggressive prosecutor, especially on the Manafort front. We saw him last month execute a search warrant to go into Manafort's house. That is that's a big move for a prosecutor to take, especially at a time when Manafort said or was trying to say publicly that he was cooperating. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of things here, and we're going to see a lot more of this in the weeks and months to come. The president is going to have a lot of these stories come out about subpoenas, about interviews, about people going before the grand jury. And there's just going to be a lot of these as we go forward. The interesting thing will be, when does real new information that sort of moves our understanding of what happened change? It's one thing when we learn about a subpoena or someone being interviewed, but it's another thing when we learn of actually, new information about things that we didn't know. And sometimes we're able to do that, and sometimes we're able to really break through and provide a lot of new context to things, and sometimes we don't. But I think this is going to go on for some time now.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.